Greetings, my name is William Morris. I am a patent attorney. I have been practicing for about 15 years, and I would like to talk today about, I'll call it the pre-patent process, specifically the research and development agreement. So this is something, right, where you've got an inventor, they have a brilliant idea, but they do not have the ability to execute or to implement it, and so they work with a contractor who has the technical knowledge, and they hopefully come up with a great product, very innovative, great inventions, lots of patents. But you need to get the contract right, or it can be a gigantic disaster, and you're done before you really get started. And so what I want to do, talking about these agreements, is three things. Thing number one, I want to tell you what I think are sort of four requirements that any good R&D agreement is going to have. They might have more than this, but these are things that they're all going to have. Number two, I want to talk about how those will kind of work out concretely in a software development agreement. And number three, I want to give you a yardstick that you can use to determine if you have satisfied those requirements. So with that, I guess let's get started. One more preface though, before we get started, I'm going to talk about the four requirements. The watchword for these requirements is concrete. You want things to be as concrete and specific as possible, and if you do that, it makes all the requirements so much easier. So, with that having been said, first requirement, on spec. You need whatever it is to be very clear about what's being delivered. And that is, you'd think that's very easy, right? Because, hey, I've got an idea, I put together my requirement specification, I'll just take the agreement, put it as an appendix, and there you go, I'm done. And that can happen. That's what I'd like to do, but it's usually not that simple. And I'm going to give you two reasons why that may not be the whole story. So reason number one, you may not actually have that good documentation. This is a new product, right? This is a new thing after all. It is a research and development agreement. So it could be that part of the development is actually fully defining what's going to happen. So there may be a step about testing different workflows, A/B testing of something. And if that's the case, then obviously you won't know in advance what's going to end up being delivered. To deal with this, what I would do is, again, go back to that guiding light of concreteness. So instead of just thinking of it as a delivery agreement where a vendor makes something and delivers it to a buyer, I will almost think of it as like a mutual services agreement. So for instance, if you got some testing phase or some design phase, say, all right, what are the parties' respective obligations during the testing and design process? Lay out a concrete framework so that you can make sure, even if you don't know 100% where you're going, you will have a good path and good guideposts to get from point A to point B, regardless of where point B, maybe it's a little bit fuzzy at the outset. The other reason that it may be a little bit difficult to get something on spec. So let's say you do have your good, nice requirements document, good specifications, you put that in an appendix, but that may not be what actually is needed to be delivered. So that's certainly going to be part of it, right? But you may also need a documentation, right? The buyer may want documents that, like a user manual that they can distribute with this product. They may want training materials. It may be that there is some training needed for the buyer themselves. So what I would say, again, it's going back to concreteness, say, okay, when this is done, the buyer is going to need to have a product that they can sell or whatever they're going to do, use it internally for their own purposes, what have you. What are they going to do? The contract's over. What do they actually need? And then when you think about it that way, you say, oh, well, what I need this thing packaged up so that it can be put in an app store. Well, okay, great. How are they going to get into the app store? Who's going to be responsible for getting through the app store approval process? And if you look about it, again, concretely, you will discover sort of these hidden requirements for the specification. Make sure they stop being hidden and make sure that everyone's on the same page about what needs to actually be delivered so that everyone's objectives can be met. That's number one, on spec. Number two, on budget. This is, again, something it seems like it could be very easy, right? I mean, price, that's, everybody deals with that every day. But it can be a little tricky. One reason is that unlike specifications, where everybody wants it to be very clear as to what it is, and the developer doesn't want to stop you from developing something, and you as the buyer, don't necessarily want to not develop something. With the budget, there is a divergence of interest, right? The buyer wants to pay less, and the developer wants to be paid more. Also, there's a problem with timing. So the buyer will ideally want to say, look, you deliver me the thing, and then I'll pay you. Whereas the developer is going to want to say, hey, you pay me, and then I will deliver the thing. Those are kind of diametrically opposed viewpoints. What I will do in this case is almost literally split the baby. So I will generally set things up like in terms of milestones, say concretely, how is this going to be done? Again, concrete is the watchword for getting a good contract together. Say concretely, how's this going to be done? All right, you start out, generally there's going to be some initial payment. Not always, but usually you're going to have that because the developer, they have to pay their employees and they need to get started with it. So there's usually some kind of an initial payment. There's usually some kinds of milestones. So you'll say, okay, milestone 1, 2, 3, try and tie some payments to that. And then at the end, whatever's left over of the agreed price, you pay that at the end after final acceptance. So I think concretely, if you can say, look, how is this thing going to be executed? All right, what can we do to tie the payments to the execution? You can kind of get both people on the same page, even though, again, the incentives are quite different and not really 100% compatible. The other reason this might be a little bit complicated beyond the incentives is just you, again, just like you may not have concrete requirements documents, you may not have a concrete sort of budget where you just say, hey, it's a fixed price, boom, I pay you this at some point, milestones, what have you. For instance, what if we're looking at a time and materials agreement? Obviously, that's not a fixed price, right? And again, this is something, it's similar to what I was describing how I will handle the specifications, where I'll say, okay, what are the two parties' responsibilities for this? Because if it's time and materials and you need to have a budget, you say, okay, how can I know what's being charged? How can I keep tracking this? So you'll say, here is what the invoicing is going to be. Here is when it's going to happen. Here is when it's going to get paid. Usually you may say, okay, it's not going to exceed XYZ without authorization, or if there's like a statement of work that's involved, you say, okay, it's not going to exceed the amount set forth in the statement of work unless there's authorization. But again, even when you're in a structure like time and materials where it doesn't necessarily follow a budget, you can still build in information that will allow the parties to tie it to a budget. And that's good for both buyer and seller, by the way, right? Buyer, because they don't exceed their budget. Seller, because that avoids them not getting paid, right? Like if I'm a startup and I've got, $50,000, that's it, right? I've raised $50,000. If my developer time and materials is me to $75,000, the extra 25 is not there. Like it's literally not there. And they don't want to eat that any more than I want to have my whole budget blown and go over this amount. So in general, I think it's good to have both people and to have a structure where you can make sure the budget is actually being met. And I think, again, concreteness is the way to do that. So that's the first two. On spec, on budget. Number 3, on time. This one, again, it's this one actually is kind of straightforward, right? You say, here is what the time is. If there's milestones, you say, here's when we expect the milestones to be. If there's sort of a mutual service approach, you say, okay, you'll do this. We'll have like meetings. The meetings will be this frequently. Here's what will happen afterwards, some kind of a time frame. I can tell you, though, you'd think this would be very simple, but I've seen agreements where people do not have this. I remember one case where the buyer had just kept paying and paying, and the developer had said, oh, we're going to deliver, and nothing was ultimately delivered that ended up being usable despite a lot of money being put into it, and it really ruined the relationship for both parties. And I think if they had had sort of a concrete structure that said, hey, milestones this, milestones that, when it started to go off the rails, they could have seen that a lot earlier in the process, rather than just sort of, again, very amorphously trying to muddle through. I think if there had been a lot more tight time, more precise time, not necessarily quick, but precise, it would have helped them out a lot and made a relationship a lot better and saved a lot of wasted time and just unpleasantness all around. So the fourth requirement for any good contract, we've been on spec, on budget, on time. The fourth is how can they trick me? When this was taught to me, this was actually the attorney who gave me this one didn't use the word trick. They used a much much ruder word, but I think trick is reasonably good for it. And this is essentially saying, and actually, let me back up. I think trick and the sort of ruder words aren't necessarily the right word, because in general, when two parties are working together, they're not going to be trying to trick each other or other things to each other, because they want to have a good relationship. There's been some diligence. We know no one's a crook because we've done our diligence before getting into bed with these people. And, most people are not fundamentally dishonest or trick people. But what can happen is you can have a contract that's written in such a way that people can have divergent assumptions, and they can have divergent incentives if things don't go necessarily the way they thought they were going to go. And so what I would do for this is to say, play the tape to the end and kind of go down those paths. Say, all right, what happens if this changes? What are my assumptions? What happens if this assumption doesn't bear out? And write the contract in such a way that even if that happens, you are not having a situation where the two parties' interests are divergent, because when they are divergent, that's when people try and start going in different ways, and then you get people feeling they've been tricked or other things have happened to them. And let me give you two examples. I'll give you one from a buyer and one from a seller side. So first from the buyer side, right? Here is how a buyer can feel that they've been tricked. They, put something together, and they, really want to get out of the agreement for some reason. And, if the contract might provide, hey, I'm going to develop this. I'm the developer. I'm going to develop this, and I'm going to make it available for you, and you can sell it to all your customers, and I'll help you get your patents at this and this and this. But if it doesn't have, not just I'm going to develop it, but A, you're going to own all the intellectual property. B, I'm actually going to deliver it to you, and I'm going to help you transition. And I'm not just going to deliver it, but I'm going to deliver the source code and the object code. The buyer may not have the right to get any of those things. And the developer may not have expected they're going to get those things. The developer may have thought they're like kind of going into this in order to kind of make a product that the developer would keep maintaining and upgrading, and for the buyer, in order to get that additional stuff that they're looking for, they may have to pay a significant amount more. And I've actually seen that happen, where the buyer said, hey, great, we got this product, now give me the source code, and the developer says, nope. And I've seen buyers have to pay more. And again, it's not necessarily because the developer is being tricky, but by the end, the buyer feels like they were tricked, even though the developer going into it, they may have just had different assumptions. So again, play it to the end, say what's going to potentially happen, and write it in such a way so the developer knows, hey, we're going to have the source code delivered, so that if they have a different model, for instance, they thought it was going to be like a SaaS thing that they would host, they can change their pricing or change their expectations so that no one feels tricked or taken advantage of. And then on the other side, developer. So again, we've talked about the startup context. So let's say the developer working with somebody who's cash poor, instead of getting all of the money, they say, well, we're going to get a percentage of your license fees, right? So you're going to license this out and we'll get a percentage of the fees. Well, what if the buyer decides to change their business model? They're no longer going to use a licensing model where they sell licenses and collect fees that way. They're going to do it as a service model where they provide very heavily discounted or maybe even free software, and they sell consulting services to people to help use it. That license fee model where the developer was going to get paid a percentage, essentially they're getting paid a percentage of zero. And again, I'm not saying that people were trying to be tricky at the outset, but the developer in this case can really feel tricked. They can feel like they got in trouble because people's incentives are not aligned. So again, what I would say, again, concrete, that's the watchword, and just go down, play the tape to the end. What happens at the end of this thing? What happens if we go down this route rather than that route? Does the contract address it? Are we clear? Are the people's incentives aligned? If you do that, you can avoid the how can they trick me part of it. And now let's talk about not milestones, the rulers, so the benchmarks, how to figure out if you've actually done these things. So I think it's a dual approach, right? It is two sides. Side number one, you'd say, okay, this contract, if everything goes according to plan, A year later, if someone takes this contract out of the drawer, will they look at it and say, yep, that's what we're doing? Now, what does this mean? What this means is it has to describe what's actually happening, and it has to do that in such a way that it's recognizable to the people who are actually going to be doing it. So you need to, in the contract, it should set forth a framework, and you should be able to look at it and say, yes, this is a framework that it describes what people are actually going to be doing, and it does it in a way that it is sustainable, and if they are doing it, they'll be able to recognize what they're doing described in that contract if they take it out of a drawer in a year. So first you look at that from if it goes well, will that be what happens? Okay, then you say if it's going wrong. So let's imagine something's going wrong, and your client calls you up and they say something's going wrong with this contract. We need to talk. And maybe they're going to be a lawsuit, or they're going to want to know what their rights are. If you can go to bed and sleep rather than sitting up at night being like, oh my gosh, this is going to be, this is bad, then good contract for you. Now, how can you know that though? What's the requirement, right? We talked about in the other one, it has to be descriptive, clear, it has to actually describe what people expect. In this case, what I do is I like to pass the buck. Or if it's something I'm very familiar, I can rely on my experience. But if you don't have like all the experience, you haven't seen something, and even I do this, by the way. So if I am in a situation, I've got a contract and it's got a provision that I don't deal with all the time, I'll say, okay, who in my office does deal with this? Who has this knowledge? So I will focus on things where I do know, because if someone says, hey, you know, there's a lawsuit going on and it's about delivery of source code, right? That is a thing I am totally familiar with, and I'm happy to talk through that. And if someone says, hey, are we protected about delivery of source code? I am comfortable. My contract's going to say that, and I'll go to sleep happy. If it's something else, I'll say, who is it who knows about this very well? And I'll go to that person and say, hey, person, we need to address this issue. Can you help us address this? And it could be the client, right? The client could say, hey, we could be saying, hey, client, you know, what is your framework for doing X, Y, Z, like invoicing, right? What's your invoicing procedure? How do you make sure things get paid? Let's put that in. Let's get that into the contract. So if I have made sure that this contract, the right subject matter experts have contributed in the right places, if there's something goes unexpectedly, I can be okay, because I know that the best people for the job have done the best parts of the job, and I can go to sleep soundly. So anyway, those are my feelings and my guidance on putting together sort of a good development agreement. So you have to be concrete to make sure it's on spec, on budget, on time, and that neither party is going to be tricking the other party. And when you play the tape to the end, it's going to be descriptive of what's actually happening. And if something goes wrong, you won't be up all night wondering where the holes are in your contract, because you know the best people and the best knowledge put it together at the outset. Anyway, so there you go. Good luck with your contracts, and I hope they're all successful and lead to many patents. And I will talk to you later.